Satoru, Gojo. The main 6. These 7 are regarded as the pinnacle of their verses, however, for entirely different reasons. One for his overwhelming abilities and raw power, the others for their kindness, laughter and loyalty, generosity, honesty, and most importantly of all, magic. And since apparently I'm now the guy who puts toddler shows up against serious characters, I'm gonna put them up against each other because, well, why not? Will the Honored One prove why he's the strongest sorcerer of today, or will the power of friendship ultimately prove too much for him? Let's find out. Will someone please remind me to slap myself across the face later for saying that? My God! First, let's start with Gojo, as he's somehow the easier of them to scale. No. Really, let me put this into perspective real quick. A battle shonen with over 200 chapters to its name, a sequel series ongoing right now, and God knows how many different hacks abilities, is somehow less nuanced to scale than My Little Pony. Anyway, Gojo should comfortably sit in the large town to city ranges of power at bare minimum. You can not only do this through his own feats, but also upscaling characters like Jogo, who he was able to absolutely clown on. This is important because in Season 2, Jogo was able to create an attack called Maximum Meteor, which according to one of the official JJK databooks, was capable of causing a massive earthquake all throughout Shibuya, which when properly measured gets anywhere from 740 kilotons of TNT all the way up to 4 megatons of TNT, or large town to small city level. This is consistent with other interpretations of Maximum Meteor, where it is also stated that it would be capable of reducing a town to ash, which would require anywhere from 4 megatons of TNT all the way up to 79 megatons of TNT, or small city level plus to city level. And because Gojo is so much stronger than Jogo, I think it's more than fair to say that he would be several layers into city level at bare minimum, potentially mountain level being generous. But luckily, we don't need to take that route because there are several other methods that you can use to get Gojo higher, with one of the most infamous ones being his Earthquake feat in chapter 221. After being released from the Prism Realm, the mere reveal of Gojo's cursed energy was more than enough to cause a massive earthquake that could be felt all the way from the trench of Japan to the mainland, which gets anywhere from 171 megatons of TNT all the way up to 13 gigatons of TNT, or mountain level to island level. This mountain to island level of power is pretty consistent as you have other characters that Gojo would massively upscale like Kenjaku, who was able to, albeit with a lot of difficulty, resist the pull of a black hole, which given his distance and the estimated radius of the black hole in question, it would require around 850 megatons of TNT on Kenjaku's part to survive. With further island level scaling coming from the fact that it's stated by Kenjaku in chapter 200 that Gojo would be capable of powering an entire nation with his cursed energy. And while it's never stated which country specifically or how long the time frame would be for him to power said country, given where Kenjaku was at the time, he was probably referring to America. And giving him a somewhat generous time frame of about a year, Gojo would be exerting around 24 gigatons of TNT in order to keep the national power grid afloat. And even if we were to assume that it would be a significantly shorter time frame than this, he would still come out to the city or mountain ranges of power. So just even more consistency for city to mountain if you don't believe that 1 year time frame for whatever reason. Now, before we move on to speed, there are a couple higher tier arguments that we have to address. There are ways that you can get Gojo higher than this, potentially in the country level ranges. Are they perfect? No, not really. Can you argue them? Yeah, definitely. But that conundrum mostly comes from domain scaling, which in that case, let's talk about it. I go over in more detail my problems with domain scaling in my Paw Patrol V.S Sukuna video, but pretty much it goes like this. Domain scaling isn't really applicable outside of almost exclusively Gojo and Sukuna, and that's for a pretty valid reason. Not only does it take an immense amount of cursed energy in order to construct a domain, but it's also stated to give buffs to a sorcerer's overall ability once inside. So if you're inside a domain, you would actually be stronger than what you are outside of it. So even saying stuff like Dagon actually did create an island or Jogo actually creating a mountain, that doesn't necessitate them being mountain or island level, because they can't replicate that kind of energy when outside of a domain. But like I said before, you could argue people like Gojo and Sukuna to be exempt from this rule. Why? Well, they're just kind of built different. No, really, that's the explanation. They are just built different. Gojo and Sukuna have repeatedly been shown capable of basically spamming their domain expansions. This is not only due to their massive reserves of cursed energy, but it's also due to the refinements of their domains. And since AP is somewhat related to how much you can output in a domain, since cursed energy is responsible for the construction of said domain, you could argue that Gojo and Sukuna's domain expansion is far greater in terms of raw output than others. Though there are a couple decent counter-arguments to this, with the biggest ones being that not only does refinement not inherently mean that you have a more powerful domain in terms of raw output, but domain expansions are also repeatedly described to be the pinnacle of what a sorcerer can achieve. But like I said, you could argue either way. So because I'm feeling really generous, let's wank Gojo a little bit. Wow, that came out wrong. Gojo should at max be in these small country ranges of power. This is due to a different interpretation of Gojo's earthquake feat that we mentioned earlier. You see, because Gojo was located in a subduction zone, he would have also been affecting the tectonic plates surrounding him. While albeit it's a small amount, it would still get anywhere from 82 gigatons of TNT all the way up to 2 teratons of TNT, or island to small country level. Granted, this is also assuming that it's using the total seismic energy, which I think is a little weird, but once again, because of where Gojo was and the fact that he did it explicitly with his cursed energy, I think it's somewhat fair to use. Though once again, this is still in the wank territory and is kind of contradicted by domain scaling, so just take that as you will. Deciphering JJK's speed can be a bit of a mess, but depending on if you think he's the strongest or at bare minimum the second strongest in the verse, this should be fairly simple to do. At absolute bare minimum, Gojo should massively eclipse a cursed Naoya, who was verbatim able to move at Mach 3. This is sort of the bare minimum for the high tiers and especially Gojo, because even to this day, there are still so many people clinging to Mach 3 being the pinnacle of the verse for whatever reason, ignoring the fact that power cliffing is a thing. Especially considering that there are so many other feats that get faster than Mach 3. Hell, Maki's first on-screen speed feat of her catching a bullet could still be scaled faster than Mach 3 depending on who you ask. It's just not an effective way of downplaying a character, let alone an entire verse. Especially when after this feat you have close to 100 chapters of potential power growth that people either seem to blatantly ignore or just hand wave away for whatever reason. Anyway, as stated before, Gojo should at bare minimum be Mach 3, however you could easily reach for high hypersonic to massively hypersonic. This can be done through not only his own feats, but also several other feats that he would also massively upscale. Like him effortlessly dodging Jogo's explosions, which gets anywhere from Mach 12 to Mach 25, Sukuna utterly blitzing piercing blood at Mach 39, and a 15-finger Sukuna saving Haruta, which gets to Mach 42. With the massively hypersonic ends of speed coming from stuff like Toji being able to react to Nue's lightning in slow motion, which gets to around Mach 228. One could argue that the lightning tier of speed is rather consistent for JJK high tiers, considering that other characters later in the story like Awakened Maki, who is comparable to Toji, could also react to lightning as well. With the highest tier of lightning timer feats coming from Hikari, who was able to react to electricity at pretty much point blank range, which gets anywhere from Mach 2600 all the way up to Mach 4700, or approaching 1% the speed of light. And since Gojo is leagues stronger and faster than Hikari, this could be enough to get him into the sub-relativistic ranges of speed. Now, admittedly, I am more lenient towards the massively hypersonic ranges of speed rather than massively hypersonic plus to sub-relativistic plus, but if you want to argue it, you definitely can. Now, there are a couple arguments for the verse reaching relativistic, but personally, I think that's the absolute highest that you can get it. You got stuff like Megana maybe reacting to Kashimo's EM waves, or Kenjaku reacting to a black hole, potentially making him relativistic, since it takes objects moving at or near the speed of light to escape one. But I'm gonna be real, Chief, those rely on some pretty heavy assumptions that we don't know for sure, especially since it gets pretty heavily contradicted by Modulo. Since when we actually see a Sukuna or Gojo tier fighter moving at relativistic speeds, regardless of its travel or combat speed, the results are something that we never see in the prior series. The absolute most that you could argue from these instances is the high or top tiers having potentially relativistic perception or reaction speeds, but that's about it. At this point, you've probably heard every nerd in existence talk about Gojo's abilities to death, so in that case, I'll just make this real quick. Curse technique laps blue pulls space, red repels space, and hollow purple is a convergence of the two, acting as a pseudo instant delete button if you want to ignore its inconsistent betrayal, with his most famous defensive ability being Infinity, which directly warps space on an atomic level to make sure that whatever projectile is traveling through space never hits Gojo, with quite possibly the most overpowered cross-verse equalizer that I've ever seen, Unlimited Void. This domain expansion overloads the target's brain with infinite information, effectively lobotomizing them in the process. Whew, boy that was a lot. Now that we've sufficiently scaled Satoru Gojo, let's move on to his opponents, the greatest defenders of Equestria, the main six. I mean, come on, they're My Little Pony characters, right? There's no way that they're that strong. Is she moving the moon and sun? Okay, we got a lot to talk about. So, as weird as this is going to sound, the main six, God, they are consistently in the multi-city block to town level ranges at absolute bare minimum, as they scale massively above characters like Spike, who was able to destroy a massive chunk of ice with his fire breath, getting all the way up to 980 tons of TNT. This level of power is consistent with other side characters like Modpie, who was able to create a giant explosion by throwing a rock, which gets all the way up to 1.2 kilotons of TNT. And since other members of the main six like Rainbow Dash and Pinkie Pie have been shown keeping up with her, they should scale to these small town levels of power as well. And before you hardcore MLP nerds get in my comments, I'm aware that this is just an alternate timeline. However, all this shows is that if they locked in, they should be comparable to her. So in my opinion, it's fair to use. Which, speaking of Rainbow Dash, she actually has several feats that gets the verse significantly higher than what we just put it at. Like her creating an absolutely enormous shockwave just by flying away, which gets as low as 63 kilotons of TNT, all the way up to 1.3 gigatons of TNT. And keep in mind, Rainbow Dash can casually create these shockwaves without even trying. And since logically speaking, her body would have had to have endured that same amount of energy in order to create the shockwave, this puts her firmly in the town to large mountain level ranges. And since the other members of the main six have repeatedly been shown capable of fighting on par with each other, this will put them firmly in the town to large mountain ranges as well. This level of power can be further backed up through the changelings, which were able to create a massive explosion that parted a massive formation of clouds, resulting in 4.2 gigatons of TNT. It's also worth mentioning that everyone was able to survive this with little to no injury, including the main six, so even more evidence that they all scale to this level of power. But enough of that. You want the real stuff. You want the real reason that you came here. Let's talk about their high ends. And this can be done through another Rainbow Dash feat, but this time it's a little different. This comes from her first ever legendary Sonic Rain Boom, where the resulting shockwave was able to part massive formations of clouds all over Equestria, resulting in about 5.4 teratons of TNT, or small country level plus. And keep in mind, she did this when she was a filly, so logically speaking, she should be significantly stronger than when she was a literal child. But we're still not done yet, because to get their highest ends of power, we have to take a look at the IDW comics, where several members of the main six, including Applejack, Rainbow Dash, Fluttershy, Pinkie Pie, and Twilight, along with a little help from Celestia and Luna, were able to pull the moon to Equestria. And considering that this likely happened within a few minutes, this would require around 39 yotatons of TNT, or firmly in the large planetary ranges of power. Now, don't get it twisted. This isn't me saying that every member of the main six is large planetary. However, even if these members of the main six were only contributing 1% of the total energy needed to move the moon in the way that they did, this would still come out to the planetary ranges of power. To be specific, anywhere from 99 to 132 zetatons of TNT. Not even close to large planet, but still super impressive nonetheless. Now, to give credit to the Skeptics Corner, you could say that this is an outlier in their physical stats, and to be honest, I wouldn't necessarily blame you, as pretty much every other feat that they have would be considerably below this. But just because of how blatant it is, I'd say it's a pretty decent highball. Kinda questionable under scrutiny, but overall pretty decent to use. While you could be skeptical of the others' scaling, we know that there is one exception to this rule. Celestia's star pupil, Twilight Sparkle. We know that by the end of the series, Twilight would scale to characters like Celestia and Luna, as she's taken the responsibility of raising the sun. Yep, Twilight has now taken on the responsibility of moving a celestial object that weighs upwards of 4.4 octillion pounds. And because we've seen Celestia literally move the sun at relativistic speeds, I mean, we've seen Twilight do it as well, this would require anywhere from 1.1 Fo to 4.08 kilofo, or large star to solar system levels of power. Now, for those who are wondering, Goji, what is a Fo? What's a kilofo? Well, allow me to educate you. A Fo is a unit of measurement used to describe one of the most powerful phenomenon in the known universe, that being a supernova, which releases around 10 to the 44 power joules. And a kilofo is a unit of measurement to describe 1,000 Fo. So yeah, if you get hit with Twilight's magic, you're basically being hit with several thousand supernovas going off at the same time. Now that we got a basic layover of their AP, let's move on to speed. And to be blunt, they should all be in the massively hypersonic ranges of speed at bare minimum. This comes from characters like Rainbow Dash being able to weave out of the way of lightning at Mach 895. This is also consistent with other feats like Tank and Applejack being able to weave out of the way of lightning at massively hypersonic speeds as well, with their higher ends of speed coming from the fact that they can pretty regularly react to magic. Well, at least Twilight can. As I said before, the others are pretty comparable to her. This is important because unicorn magic is shown to be capable of traveling the distance between the Earth and Moon in under a second at 1.6 to 3.6 times the speed of light. And once again, since all the members of the main six, including Twilight, have been shown keeping up with each other, this would firmly place them in the faster than light ranges of combat and reaction speeds. And even if you don't think this lineup scaling applies to the main six, it would to Twilight, as since she's taken the responsibility of raising the sun, she should be capable of replicating the feat she performed in Season 4. And while she was massively amped, the fact that she's able to do this right now is proof that she should scale to it. Now, believe it or not, there's actually several ways that you could get the main six higher than FTL, with the most infamous of these being Rainbow Dash capable of moving at Warp 8 speeds. Which, if you know anything about Star Trek, I sure don't. The warp scale essentially is a measure on how many times faster than light you are while, warping through space, with Warp 8 having been determined to require speeds of upwards of 512 times the speed of light to reach, or firmly in the massively faster than light ranges of speed. Now, some may default to this just meaning travel speed, as, well, it is a travel speed feat, but many forget that Rainbow Dash is capable of actively turning at these speeds. And even if we were to say this is just travel speed, several characters such as Pinkie Pie and even Fluttershy at one point have been able to somewhat keep up with her, so they should all just scale to this regardless. Now that we got a basic rundown of their speed, what about their abilities? And unfortunately, several members of the team don't really have any abilities per se to speak of. Twilight is the one who is doing like 95% of the heavy lifting here. And yeah, she makes up for that. Transmutation, teleportation, telekinesis, shield creation, speed enhancements, duplication, potentially having mind control, sealing, the list goes on. Add on to that she basically has the intelligence of a super genius, and she's definitely going to be the MVP here. But surprisingly, Pinkie Pie actually has several abilities that are pretty noteworthy. Like her being able to somehow reassemble her body like Lego bricks after being split into several dozen pieces, and the other being her gag-related teleportation, which is really gonna come in handy in a minute. Now that we've finally established the strength, speed, durability, and abilities of both camps, let's see who would win between the strongest sorcerer of the modern day and the strongest defenders of Equestria, Satoru Gojo or the main six. Now, in terms of their raw physical stats, this is surprisingly cut and dry. The main six pretty comfortably fitting in that town to large mountain ranges of power means that they should at worst be a little bit behind, if not comparable to Gojo's mid to high end stuff. And even if we were to use some of the arguments that could potentially get Gojo in the island to small country ranges of power, you'd have to give the same leniency to the main six, in which, oh my god, it becomes so much worse for Gojo. As even when she was a literal child, Rainbow Dash was capable of creating a feat that was at worst comparable, if not slightly stronger than the best interpretations of Gojo's Earthquake. Let alone several members of the main six literally pulling the moon to a planetary yield. Meanwhile, the only way to scale Gojo to planetary is by saying he upscales a suicide attack that was going to destroy the planet and therefore kill everyone on it. But don't worry, it gets worse. As even if you don't think the celestial scaling applies to the other members of the main six for whatever reason, it most definitely would for Twilight. With her being able to output large star to solar system levels of power, it doesn't matter what argument you use for Gojo because he is getting completely atomized. And unfortunately for Gojo, that same difference applies to Speed as well. As even being generous to Gojo and saying he's in the subrelativistic to relativistic ranges of reaction and perception speed, several members of the main six being able to pretty casually react to magic which can move at several times the speed of light means that Gojo is getting speed blitzed several times over. It gets even worse, especially if you use the massively faster than light ranges of speed for Rainbow Dash, which the other members of the main six should scale to. Meaning that all of them should technically be capable of surviving, tanking, if not just outright avoiding whatever attack Gojo throws at them with little difficulty. But we're not done yet, as Gojo actually has two attributes that do make this a pretty interesting discussion to be had. His curse technique, Infinity, and his domain expansion, Unlimited Void. You see, even though we've already established that the main six should at worst be capable of matching, if not just straight up stat stomping Gojo, all that strength is pretty much useless because they can't hit him. So, do they have a way past Infinity? Yep, several actually. And we know this because of Twilight's telekinesis and her teleportation, with both being basically the perfect counters for Infinity. Because teleportation isn't literally traveling through space, it's just arriving at one point instantaneously from another. And telekinesis also isn't an attack that can just be detected and then slowed down by Infinity. It just kinda happens. So either A, Twilight could just teleport onto Gojo and then beat the brakes off of him, or B, just grab him with her telekinesis and then use him as a human battering ram. Or just crush him. Either goes, honestly. Which is all neat and dandy, but do they have a counter for Gojo's ultimate ability, Unlimited Void? And surprisingly, no, they don't. Yep, this is the one guaranteed win con that Gojo has. If Gojo does somehow get them caught in a domain expansion, then yeah, they're just cooked. Like, there's nothing that they can do. However, this is a huge, humongous, absolutely massive if. While obviously they wouldn't know what Infinite Void did the first time around, they definitely figure out that something is about to happen when Gojo starts throwing up a hand sign and speaking. Especially considering the 0.2 second activation time for Unlimited Void is absolutely child's play compared to what the main six can react to. So like, even if Gojo were to unleash Unlimited Void, the chance of it actually landing is shockingly low, like to the point where it's almost impossible in my opinion. Now, all that already sounds pretty bad on its own, right? All of them should be capable of at worst contending with him and at most completely stat stomping Gojo into the ground, as well as having several members like Twilight and Pinkie Pie who can easily bypass his one major defensive ability through teleportation or other means. Not to mention the one guaranteed win con that Gojo has if it lands is not even a guaranteed hit because of the immense stat difference between them. But what if I told you it gets even worse? Because there are ways that they can win even without lifting a hoof, or whatever. As they could just call any of these three to help or even beat Gojo for them. And yeah, I know it's not technically in character for Celestia or Luna to just step in and do all the work for the main six, but Discord definitely would do almost anything for Fluttershy, so yeah. The things that Discord, the nigh omnipotent reality warping chaos god, would do to Gojo if he somehow managed to hurt Fluttershy, would go down in history books. So even if Gojo does somehow win against the main 6, he still loses. So yeah, low-key, Gojo is cooked. They are significantly stronger at their best, significantly faster at their best, and have multiple ways of not only bypassing infinity, but potentially avoiding the one win con that Gojo actually has. On top of having top-tier insurance if they somehow manage to lose. The main 6 win.